Hello and welcome to the second episode of our Appium tutorial series. Today we will be installing and running Appium on OS X, as well as writing our first Appium test and running it live on a real device we have connected to our machine. For the duration of this tutorial, you will be able to see what is happening on the screen of the device in the window to the right. The first thing we'll need to do is to grab Appium itself. This can be done by visiting appium.io. Since we will be writing our tests in Java, we'll also need an IDE. In this case, I will be using IntelliJ IDEA, but you can stick to your usual Java IDE. As dependencies for our test, we will need the Appium Java client. In this case, I'll be using version 3.3.0, and the Selenium standalone server too. In this case, we will be using version 2.48. And last but not least, we will need Xcode version 5.1 or higher. We must also not forget to enable UI automation on our device. This is achieved by navigating to Settings, Developer Options, and ticking Enable UI Automation. Once that has been taken care of, we can actually install and run Appium. The first time we run Appium, we will be confronted with a screen that looks more or less like this. From here, we will be able to start the Appium server and the Appium Inspector, which we will need to find ways to access the app's UI elements. Before we do that though, we need to spend a minute on configuration. Since we will be running our tests on iOS, make sure that iOS is selected as the current target platform for our tests. Once we open up the iOS settings tab, we see that there's a lot to be customized here. Fortunately, we won't need to fill in all the fields. One that we definitely need to provide though is the app path. For the purpose of this tutorial, I will be testing the Komoot app, and this means I need the Komoot app IPA that fortunately I have right here. Once that has been taken care of, we also need to activate the Force Device field. No worries about the actual device. This is used for the device name, so you can actually input whatever you want. Next up is the UDID. This is the unique ID of your connected device. How to get to that? We just open up Xcode, navigate to the Devices window, and select the device that we want to test on. Here we will find the UDID under the identifier field. We will also need to select the full reset option so that after every test our app gets uninstalled and the data from the app cleared. This ensures that every time we run a test we have a clean start. We will also need to navigate to the Advanced tab so that we can make sure that the Xcode path actually points to our Xcode installation. That's it. We're finally ready to launch the Appium server. You will see the log start to fill up. And once you get the first 200 response from the server, you can actually launch the inspector. What this will do is actually install the app on the phone and open up the inspector UI, which you should see in a second. As you can see, the Komoot app has launched on our phone, and the inspector should follow soon. So this is the Appium Inspector. What it allows us to do is to select elements of the UI, as these buttons, for example. What we see on the right side of the Appium Inspector is not another live feed from the phone. This is actually a screenshot of the UI of the application that we have just installed. By clicking on elements in this screenshot, we can select UI elements from the application. We can also explore the whole UI through the frames on the left. This allows us to select any element in the UI. And once we select an element, this will be highlighted in the screenshot. And once an element has been highlighted, we can see its details on the central frame. We will be using this information to select UI elements and interact with them in our Appium test. Now that we have a way to reference elements in the UI and a working Appium instance, we can start writing our tests. So let's open up IDEA and create a new project. In this tutorial we will be using a basic Java project, but you can grab the dependencies that we have manually downloaded before through Gradle, through Maven, however you prefer. Now that IDEA has created a project for us, we can create our test class. Since we will be using JUnit to run our tests with Appium, the first thing we need to do is think about our setup method. What we will be doing in here is, first of all, setting up a connection to the Appium server. Before we can do that, though, we need to navigate to project structure and import the dependencies that we need. So the first thing we need to do here is instantiate an iOS driver. To instantiate a driver, though, we need to pass over two things. First, we need to provide an endpoint, and in this case, we will be providing HTTP localhost with the standard default Appium port /wd/hub. In this way, we will be communicating with our local Appium server. That's not enough, though. We need to provide some capabilities as well. So we first create a desired capabilities object. And the only capability we need to set for now is the device name. Again, the device name can be whatever you want. This is kind of weird, but bear with me. Of course, we have to take care of an exception here. In this case, we will just throw it since we don't need to handle it. So, with the code we've written until now, what will happen is every time we launch a new test, we will be establishing a new connection to the Appium server. This is fine, but we also need to end a session after a single test run is ended. Otherwise, we will be keeping the Appium server busy with a previous stale session. This is easily achieved. What we need is a simple teardown method that will run after every test. So we'll take advantage of the after annotation. Here, the only instruction that we need to call is driver.quit. And for that to make any sense, we need to have a global driver. Okay, at this point, we can start writing our test. We will need to use the test annotation for every test method that we write. And something that's very important is actually to give a meaningful name to your test method. This means that we need to be sure about what we're actually going to do in this method. So let's take a step back and check out the Appium Inspector again. Since we still need to make sure that our current setup is working, we will just perform a very simple action at the beginning. We will be tapping on the Login with Email button. So our method will be called select login with email. So the first thing that we will need to do will be to find an element. So driver find element. And we will need to provide a strategy through which we're going to look for this element. In this case, we'll look for the element by name. Basically, we'll provide the text value of the login with email button. We can see it up here. We will just copy it and paste it in our code. Once this has been done, we can just go on and click on the element. We could now try and run our test immediately, but if we did that, our test would fail. And that's because we still have the Appium Inspector running. This means that the server has an open session that's already busy. We need to get rid of that before we can run our test. To solve this problem, just navigate back to the Appium Inspector, close it, restart the server, and wait for the logs to fill up again. And then you know that you're good to go with your test. So let's run our first test. Check what the Appium log is saying. Okay, we've seen that a new session has been started. The app is getting installed on our device right now, so we should see it pop up at any moment. And there it is. And now we should see the screen change because we would be performing a click on login with email. There it is. And our test has succeeded. But did we really just write and run our first Appium test? Sort of, but not really. We just remote controlled our phone and performed one action on it. We can see that the button was found and clicked correctly because the test succeeded, but we were not checking anything more than that. What we want to do now is write a real test, something that reproduces a possible use case and checks against an expected outcome. To do so, let's restart the Appium Inspector and navigate through the application until we have found a possible use case that we can automate. Let's focus on what happens after we click on the login with email button. As you can see, we're taken to a different screen in which we can input an email and a password, just as you would expect. So what we will be doing here is actually type some invalid email address and a valid password. Then we will be clicking the login button. At this point, we will get this error message. So we know what we want to check against if a user is entering a invalid email. So let's now switch back to IntelliJ IDEA once more, and let's immediately change the name of our test method before we forget. Our new name will be login with invalid email. Okay, so now what we need to do is think about the interactions that we will have to automate. So immediately after clicking this first login with email button, we will be presented with a new screen containing two text views, text fields, and a further button to confirm that we want to log in with the details that we have just provided. So let's say we need to insert email credential. This will be the first thing that we need to do after clicking the login with email button. Then we will also need to insert password credentials. And after that is done, we will need to click login button. Okay. We don't just want to perform these actions and then stop though. We also want to check against a particular error message, the one that we just saw before. So here we will have some kind of assertion. Assert that error message is correct. So now what we need to do is simply go back to the inspector, select the elements that we need to interact with, grab them here in the code, and then interact with them accordingly. So let's now switch back to our inspector, access the second screen by clicking on Login with Email on our phone, and then by hitting refresh. Again, this is not a live feed from the phone, so every time you change the screen or something changes on your screen, you will need to manually refresh it. And now, as you can see, we can select the email password field and the login button that we will need. So first of all, we will be referencing the email field. There's a variety of ways to do this, and right now I'm going to show you how to do this through XPath. We won't be using this XPath query that you see here in the central frame for a simple reason. This query is automatically generated by Appium, and what it's doing is basically starting from the very root of the UI hierarchy. It's going down through each element until it gets to the one that we have highlighted, using indexes on every single element of this chain. What this means is that this query will be extremely brittle, meaning that if anything changes at any point of the chain, if any new element is introduced, for example, the query will break. And that's in the best scenario actually, because it might also be that because of just random chance, you will find yourself with a query that's now selecting another element. And this might even cause you to waste some time trying to understand why all of a sudden your test is doing something that it was not supposed to do at all. What I suggest you do instead is click on the Copy XML button. This will copy what is essentially an XML representation of the UI hierarchy straight to your clipboard. Then open up your browser and navigate to any website that offers you the possibility to test an XPath query against an XML. Paste your XML there, and then build your own query. In this case, we will try to grab this UIA text field element, which is inside a UIA table cell, which itself is inside a UIA table view. So if I am lucky enough, there are probably only two UIA table cells on the screen. So basically this one and the one below containing the password label and the password field. So what I can do is something like this. I will select all the UIA table cells, or actually just the first one, and inside there I will select the only text field actually. As we can see, this query returns one element, which is what we're looking for, and that element's value is email. So if we go back to the inspector, we can see that if we select this text field, its value is email, so probably we're selecting the right element. So now we just copy our query, go back to our code, driver find element by XPath this time, paste the XPath query that we just generated, and in this case we're not just performing a click. We don't just want to click on the email field. We want to send an actual string, so we will use the send keys method. And in this case we will send in invalid@gmail, so clearly an invalid email address. Of course we can do the same for the rest of the elements that we need to select. So now we can also select our login button and click it as well. Now the last thing we need is the error message. So now we'll just go back to our phone, simulate the interaction that we're automating, invalid@gmail, and our password. We'll push the login button, and we will go back to the inspector, refresh, and now we can grab the error message. After testing out our new XPath query, we can proceed to find our last element, which in this case is the alert itself. Once we have the element, we want to grab its text, and we want to wrap this into an assertion stating that the content of this element must be equal to, and in here we will just put the expected error message, which is invalid email address. So now we should be ready to run our test. What I can tell you already though is that unfortunately this will not work. Basically, if you go back to our application and you try to log in again, you can see that it takes a split second for our message to show up. So the problem is that here, what Appium will do is try to get this element immediately after we've clicked login, and Appium might be too fast in doing this. So what we should do instead is actually wait for this element to appear and setting a timeout. So we'll say we'll wait for this element for 15 seconds, and if it appears within those 15 seconds, we will then proceed and get its text and do this assertion to find out if we are correct about the content of the error message. We create a new WebDriver wait element to which we have to pass the driver and the timeout. We set 15 seconds, and we can wait until an expected condition is met. In this case, the presence of the element located by our XPath query. So what we get from this is actually our own mobile element that we can call error dialog. So once we have our error dialog, for which we have waited up to 15 seconds, we can just write error dialog get text and see if it equals invalid email address. So what we do now, we finally run our first Appium test and we see how it goes. We can see our app has been launched. Now we click on the login with email button. We fill in the first field with our invalid email. We switch to the second field, send in a password, then click on the login button, and we get our error message, which we check against, and our test succeeds. So congratulations on running your first Appium test on iOS. We hope this video has been useful. If you're interested in running Appium tests in the cloud on multiple devices, please visit us at testobject.com.